Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of the Bernina L460 Serger Manual. Today I want to talk about pages 18 and 19 in the Serger Manual. Those pages deal with threads and needles. And I thought it'd be kind of fun to start with the all-purpose or basic threads and needles, and then I'll show you some decorative things as well and give you some tips for getting good results using decorative threads, and then also how to get good results using knits. So I have a few little things I want to talk about today. So let's start with your serger thread and your needles. When you open the front cover of your serger, you'll see there's a package of all-purpose universal needles from Bernina right in your serger. That's very handy and cool. The best news about that, though, is the fact that they are in fact universal needles. That means that you can use your Schmetz and organ needles in your serger, and you don't have to have a special overlock needle for this serger. So that's pretty handy. So, if you don't have your Bernina needles handy, just know you can use the needles you're using in your sewing machine in your serger as well. So that's the first thing I wanted to point out. The next thing is, if you're just getting your first serger and you don't have any serger thread, consider buying just a few colors to get yourself started. Serger thread can be a little bit pricey because there's a lot of thread on the spool, and you don't need to buy every color in the rainbow to match your fabric stash. I recommend getting a black or navy, a white or ivory, and then a gray. Gray is like a chameleon, and it will blend with many of the colors in your fabric stash. I use gray a lot because it really blends in nicely, and it eliminates my need to have multiple other colors that I don't have in my stash. So that's what I would start out with. I mean, you certainly can get as many colors as you want, but just remember you need 4 spools of each color, so it can get to be a lot. Now, one question I get about serger thread and matching colors to fabric is, do I need to use matching thread or thread that goes with the fabric I'm working with in the needles and the loopers? Or do I just need to put the color that matches in my needles? Now, when you think about that, it seems like it would make sense that if you're working with black fabric, let's say, and you have black thread in your needles, you could use any colors you wanted in your loopers because the needles are the things that are on the very, inside edge of your stitch, and it would make sense that the black needle threads would blend with the fabric and the looper threads wouldn't show because they're looper threads. In fact, if we look at the underside of the stitch, you can see the red line of stitching running along the base. That's the looper thread catching with the needle threads to form the stitch. The same thing is true on the top side of the fabric. The upper looper thread mixes with the needle thread to form the stitch. So keep that in mind when you're planning which colors you're going to use in your serger. And that's why, again, I recommend just getting a few basic colors that can go a long distance to get you started. And then as you start working on more projects, you can add more colors. But I really think you can get away with just a few basics that will blend in. And just as a rule, use a dark color with dark fabric, use a lighter color with light fabric. And then if you're in that middle of the road kind of color, try gray, because gray will do a lot of really lovely camouflaging for you. You want to get a good quality all-purpose thread. So I have in my stash Mettler serger thread, Gutermann serger thread, and Maxi Lock. Those 3 brands are pretty reliable, and they're made from longer fibers, and they're not as furry or linty as less expensive brands. So consider getting some good quality thread, because I think it will make a much better stitch quality in your serger, and it will make less of a mess because it's a smoother, finer thread. All right, so I'm going to put those aside. We've talked about all the meat and potato basic serger threads and then basic needles. So my needle management kind of goes like this. I always start with a universal needle and I see how that works out, because needles are also expensive, and if you start buying specialty needles, they can get a little bit pricey. So I start with a universal needle, and then if I don't get a good stitch quality, that's when I consider switching. And I just want to show you an example. This is an example of a knit that I was working on or working with in a class recently. I could not get it to stitch right using my universal needles. So what I did was I switched to stretch needles. All right, you can see here that when I switched to stretch needles, the stitch looked much better. Okay, so sometimes if you've tried everything, you've adjusted your tensions, you've made sure, you know, you're on the right differential feed setting, you've got everything set up properly, and it's still not stitching right, and you're working with a knit, try a stretch needle. The difference between a stretch needle and a universal needle is the stretch needle has a little bit more of a ball point to it, so it's not going to catch on the fibers on the surface of your stretch fabric. And while I have this up, I'm going to put a picture, a really close-up picture of these stretch needles so you can see it on the screen. You'll notice there are two bands of color up near the top, or up near the top of the needle. That is Schmet's color coding, which makes it really easy to tell what kind and what size needle you're working with. Sometimes you take your needles out of the package and then they become loose in your sewing box and you're not really sure what they are. And as I get older, I have a harder time squinting and seeing the printed size and type on the actual needle. So these bands of color have really become my best friend. So you can see here, this is the color chart. And I think you can download it right off of Schmet's Needles website. But basically, the top band of color is going to tell you what kind of needle it is. So you can see from the picture, the close-up picture, it's a yellow band, which means it's a stretch needle. And then if you look at the second band, it's navy blue. So if we go on this side, you can see that it's a size 14. So if you're working with Schmet's Needles, get yourself a copy of the color chart, because it'll make it very easy for you to identify what kind of needle your loose needle is. All right, so that takes care of, when I would use a specialty needle when I'm working with knits. The next thing I want to talk about is heavier weight decorative threads. Traditionally, heavyweight decorative threads are most commonly used in the loopers, because the loopers have a much larger eye than the needles. And I think what I'll do is, I don't want my serger to feel like it's not the star of the show here, because I haven't been, I'm not going to really stitch on it today. So let me just show you though a close-up of how big the holes on the loopers are. All right, so you can see here, I think I'm going to stick a piece of my yellow Post-it note behind my looper here, so you can see the hole of that needle is pretty large. So that means it's going to be pretty easy for you to thread a heavier weight thread through the loopers. Now, why would you want to use a heavyweight thread in your serger? Well, let me show you. All right, so using a heavier thread in your loopers will allow you to do fun things like decorative edges on either hems or home deck projects like this fleece sample I have. You can make a wonderful fleece blanket in such a short amount of time using a heavy decorative thread in your loopers. So this particular thread is Pearl Crown Rayon. So I have this Pearl Crown Rayon here. And the one thing I want to show you about Pearl Crown Rayon is it's very slippery. And when you're working with it, what can happen is the thread can actually slide off the spool and get stuck under the spool while it's on the spool stand. So you can see here I have a thread net, and you get some thread nets when you purchase the serger, and they're very handy for protecting the thread from sliding to the bottom of the spool and getting caught under the spool. So basically, if you just stick your thread net on like this, then you can see the thread is just going to spool up, up and over the antenna. It allows it to feed nice and smoothly into your machine. So consider using your thread nets for threads that slide or look like they're going to get stuck underneath your spool. So this is the Pearl Crown Rayon. And then there are others too. You can use things like jean stitch thread is heavier, or Wonderfill has a really nice thread called Glamour. And this is a really nice metallic, heavier thread that you can get beautiful results with. One thing that sometimes I think people don't think of is you actually can use a heavier thread in your needle for certain techniques. So for example, here's a reverse flat lock, and you can see that I used the silver version of this Glamour thread in my needle because when you do a reverse flat lock, the little ladders are being formed by the needle thread. So to do that in your serger, you want to use a top stitch needle. And for use in a serger, I recommend using either a size 12 or 14. And again, here's a close-up of the top stitch needle on the screen so you can see it while I'm talking. The reason why you want to use a top stitch needle is notice how long the hole or the eye of the needle is. It gives you plenty of room to thread your decorative thread through. So use a top stitch needle when you're using a decorative thread to create like a reverse flat lock like this. Okay. Another kind of thread that's also very cool to use in your serger is woolly nylon. Woolly nylon has this unique property where, let me get a dark background so I can show you here. I'll use this as a sort of as a dark background. You can see that when it's relaxed, it's nice and fluffy. And when you pull it tight, it looks like a regular thread. So woolly nylon is great in the loopers when you want it to expand and get more coverage or create a more dense stitch. For example, when you're doing a rolled hem on the edge of a napkin, if you use the woolly nylon in the upper looper, it will fill in the spaces between each individual stitch and make it look like a solid edging on, you know, napkins, or you can use it to finish hems and all sorts of things. So I want to give you a tip for threading this into your serger. So let me get the serger back over here. All right, so if you're working with a decorative thread and you're having trouble getting it through the looper or the eye of the looper, I'm going to give you a little tip here. I'm going to take a piece of my all-purpose thread, maybe, you know, 12 inches or so. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to remove my presser foot so you can see. And actually, I'm going to put my knife down too. All right, so what I'm going to do here is I'm going to take the two ends of the all-purpose serger thread and I'm going to swizzle them together like this. And then I'm going to shoot them through the eye of the looper together. And what I've created here is a thread cradle. Okay, so I've got a loop here. Okay, and then if I was working with something like woolly nylon that's really not easy to get through the eye of the looper because it's fuzzy, let me just thread it to that point so I can show you. Okay, so see how this is a fuzzy end, and it really, see how fuzzy that is? So what you do is you just put it through the loop of your thread cradle, okay, and then pull it straight back. And see how easy that is to thread? So that's how you can very easily thread your upper looper with something like a woolly nylon or really any heavy decorative thread. Now, if your serger was already threaded and you're just switching out your all-purpose thread for a heavier thread, you can also tie it through and pull it. So let's pretend this is all-purpose thread. I'm just going to cut that. I'm going to take that off. And then let's say I want to use this Wonderfill thread. So I'm just going to put it through on top of the antenna. And then what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to take both pieces together create a loop like this. And then I'm just going to tuck the tails through the loop. And I'm treating both pieces as if they were a single strand of thread. And that way I've created a knot that's not going to come undone as it goes through the machine. But basically, there's my knot. And then I'm just going to cut the tails really short to remove the bulk. Okay, so watch what happens. I'm just going to pull this through. And you can see it going through. It's going through the tension. Now it's going through the threading path and then through the eye of the looper. Okay, so that's another way that you can thread a heavier thread or a thread that's not easy to get through the eye of the looper. All right, so that's my little threading tip for that. All right, so the last thing I want to mention is, in general, if you're working with all-purpose serger thread, start with your tensions on 4, because that is the basic starting point when you're working with this Bernina L460 serger. If you're working with a thread that's lighter than all-purpose thread, you may need to make the tension a little bit tighter. And if you're working with a thread that's heavier than the all-purpose thread, you may need to tighten the tension. And I've also played with woolly nylon. All right, so here's an example of a edge finish on a knit. And you can see here I used a variegated woolly nylon. And when I was using this in my serger, I actually had to tighten the lower looper thread to hold the woolly nylon all the way to the edge. So sometimes you need to play with the balance of your tension if you're working with a specialty stitch as well. So I recommend getting yourself a sample piece of fabric, and if you're doing an edge finish, practice on a single layer, and if you're doing a seam finish, practice on a double layer of fabric, and then you can work out your little tension settings and different things before you work on your garment. Look at what your stitch is doing and then make small adjustments. The last thing I just want to mention about tension settings is that you have numbers on your Bernina from 1 to 9. So when you're adjusting your tension to fine-tune the quality of your stitch, don't jump from 4 to 5 or from 4 to 3 to lower it. There are an infinite number of settings between the numbers, so just make a fine-tune adjustment. Literally go a third of the way to the next number and see if it fixes it. And if it doesn't, you can, make it a little tighter or a little bit looser. So those are my tips for using needles, threads, and tension settings, and just a few tips for getting good quality stitches depending on the fabric and thread you're using. If you have any questions about needles, threads, or anything else, please post them below and I will help you. I hope you're enjoying this serger series, and I will be back next week with another episode of the Bernina L460 Serger Manual.